is Godly Heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Topic today is what to do when culture hates you. We are in a situation in which cultural hostility towards Christians has intensified. So how do we really make our case in the public sphere? So often here on Point of View, we want you to know how to articulate a biblical worldview and also to know how to defend a biblical worldview. And that really will be our topic today as we talk with an individual who's been on the program with us many times before, Natasha Crain, who is a speaker, podcaster, author of 5 books, and certainly has been working in this field. We've interviewed her in the past on some of her kids' books, talking with your kids about Jesus, about God, or even keeping your kids on God's side. Last time we talked with her was about her book, Faithfully Different, Regaining Biblical Clarity in a Secular Culture, as well as now this new book, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. The book is out. It is forward by Frank Turek, and she was just recently on his program. Endorsements from a variety of people that we've had on this program, like Jack Hibbs and Greg Kokel and Erwin Lutzer and Andrew Walker and John Stonestreet and Jim Daly and Kirk Cameron, Elisa Childers, to mention just a few of the number of people that have endorsed this book. It is published by Harvest House. We have information about it. You can perhaps find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to her website, natashacrain.com. And of course, you don't even have to remember how to spell all that because it's on our website, pointofview.net. Natasha, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks so much. Great to talk with you again.
It's good to see you at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention as well. And I thought we would get right into it because some have already perhaps heard the interview you did with Frank Turek. Others may be hearing some that will be coming up, some that you taped, which will be airing later. But when we talk about this, one of the ways you begin, interestingly enough, is to point out that when we look at certain religious groups, and you use, for example, Heaven's Gate, people saw that cult as delusional, or when they look at Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or others, they think these people are a little bit annoying, or even when they look at, say, Amish, Mennonite, maybe they're a curiosity. But in every case, you argue, and I think accurately so, the culture doesn't hate them, but there is one group that is hated, and that is the group known as evangelical Christians. Remember a survey that came out a while back which asked professors at major universities, what is the greatest threat to America? You'd think there are all sorts of things they could have listed, but evangelical Christians were on the list. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised. Jesus said, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. But I guess that really makes the premise for your book that culture really does hate us.
That's right. It's funny because sometimes people have responded to the title and said, well, hate is such a strong word. And my response to that was, well, okay, take it up with Jesus. Because like you said, 2,000 years ago, Jesus was warning his disciples that the world would hate them. And so I think it is a fair assessment. The question is, well, what exactly does that mean and look like at any given point in time in a given cultural context? So, you mentioned the opening of the book and how I compared this with the Amish or the Heaven's Gate cult, for example. And what I explained there is that when you look at those groups have some contrarian values against society, but they're not out there advocating to change society with those values. And so culture might have some kind of negative assessment of them, like you mentioned, but they don't hate them in the way that they hate Christians, because we, if we're actually living according to what the Bible would tell us, we're actually out there advocating for righteousness in society. We should be trying to influence the world. So that's why the culture hates us, because we do hold contrarian values, but we're also advocating with those values to change society.
And that, I think, is really important. One of the booklets we've made available on postmodernism is postmodernism seems very tolerant because you have your views and I have my views. But as soon as you assert that my views are not only good for me, but good for you, that's where you start being called intolerant. So that certainly is a key issue. And I might just say for our listeners, as we work our way through the book, the first 5 chapters help us understand the hate. The next 5 chapters help us to respond to and persevere through some of these very significant issues in the culture. But since the book is entitled When the Culture Hates You, I've talked about the issue of hate, and you've certainly addressed that. The other part is culture. Who or what is culture? Because that's important to understand what we're going to be talking about today, isn't it?
Right. It is important to understand because that word can be used in so many different ways. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'll see some kind of formal definition about it being the dress and the customs and the language of a given group of people. But if you think about how that term is used in a more colloquial sense, that's the way that I'm using it in this book, that culture is basically represents the individuals and the institutions in society that hold the values that are widely considered to be accepted and celebrated today. So if somebody says, yeah, today's culture thinks that, you immediately kind of know how that sentence could end. You can think of all kinds of things like feelings are the ultimate guide or happiness is the ultimate goal of life. You can fill in those blanks because you know that culture represents the general spirit of the times. It's what people generally think to be true and is what is acceptable to think in a lot of cases.
Natasha Crain with us, and again, forward by Frank Turek, When Culture Hates You. It is written by her and, of course, published by Harvest House Publishers, which, again, I would certainly encourage you to look for the book in your local bookstore, but we have information about the book on the website, information about her website, also links to Facebook and X and other places there as well. And again, we are certainly reminded by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed are you when others revile you. So certainly that is the case, but it brings us maybe to the next chapter, and that is the issue of common good, because our argument is that we aren't just saying this because we think we're right, we're also saying it because God said it, and more importantly, these biblical ideas lead to human flourishing, don't they?
That's exactly right. And I think that this is where Christians have a big misunderstanding in a lot of cases where we think, well, there are lots of people's opinions about, what's good for society. So, we have our opinion, but other people have theirs too. So what are we supposed to do about that? We don't want to impose our ideas of the good on others. But that's just a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of Christianity. Christianity is an entire worldview that corresponds with reality. It's the truth of all things. And so if that's the case, yes, other people might have different opinions about what is good for society and for individuals, but if those opinions don't line up with what God has objectively said is true and what is objectively good, then those opinions are simply wrong. So as Christians, we have to get really clear on what is actually good in an objective sense so that we can advocate for true righteousness in society.
Let's take a break. When we come back, let's get into that, because certainly God defines what is the common good, and then certainly the common good also involves politics, which, of course, as you point out in your book, this is about more than just politics, but it certainly deals with the idea of being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. So we're going to kind of get into this idea of good and common good, and then that gets us into something, of course, our good friend Dr. Frank Turek wrote about years ago, and that is legislating morality. Can we really begin to articulate those views, and how do we do so? Lots of very helpful ideas that are in this new book, When Culture Hates You. We'll come back and continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Sean McDowell observes that in a culture that glamorizes sex, chases fame, and shames those who don't fall in line, it takes a rebel to be a Christian. That is why the title of his new book is A Rebel's Manifesto. His book for young Christians focuses on the challenge, the culture, relationships, sexuality, ethics, and cultural engagement. He published much of this in a previous book as Ethics, Being Bold in a Whatever World. When I did a radio program with him, we talked about the fact that he needed to both update chapters and add new chapters. The section on relationships were added because of current problems with loneliness, bullying, and suicide, and a chapter on transgender ideology also needed to be added. You know, we talked about the fact that Sean McDowell will oftentimes role play as an atheist and take questions from Christian students. After he finishes, he asks them to describe how they treated their atheist guests. They often use words like rude, aggressive, and disrespectful, and then concludes that if this is how they treated a fellow Christian role-playing as an atheist, perhaps they have a lot to learn about better loving their neighbors. We also spent some time talking about the influence of smartphones and social media. For example, he lists 5 ways smartphones influence you. It affects, for example, how we access truth. It affects us emotionally and spiritually. It also affects our identities and relationships. This is a book that you should give to your children or grandchildren, but I would also encourage you to give a copy to your youth leader. At the end of each chapter are questions that can be used to guide a small group discussion with young people. These are issues they confront, and they need a sound biblical perspective this book provides. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Natasha Crain as we talk about her new book, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Culture and in a Public Square. It is really important to understand how to be articulate and at the same time gracious. But Natasha, I think it is important to maybe get into this issue. Why do people disagree on what's good? And part of it goes back to a phrase that Francis Schaeffer used to use. People, even well-meaning Christians, oftentimes see the world in bits and pieces. They don't see the totality of a worldview. And a worldview, you say, is a lens through which we should see everything. And as a result, sometimes we even find our fellow Christians say, well, we really don't need to be advocating for the common good in the public square. We just need to be preaching the gospel. But you have a different viewpoint because you believe that the Christian worldview should affect every area of life.
That's right. You know, when people say that we should just be preaching the gospel, I always want to ask, well, how do you define the gospel? Because that's a very limited view of what the gospel is, right? You know, when we come to put our trust in Jesus as our Lord and Savior, we love him by following his commands, as he said himself. And so what are those commands? Well, if we think of the 2 greatest commandments, to love God first and then to love others. Well, to love others necessarily has to be shaped by what it first means to love God. There's a reason for that hierarchy of commandments. So if we're going to love others, that's going to include caring about their lives in the context of the societies in which they live. So loving others doesn't just mean that we share the gospel with them. Of course we share the gospel with them, but that doesn't mean we can't do anything else. So it's always kind of funny when people say, but we need to preach the gospel. Yes, we do. Absolutely. That doesn't preclude us from loving others in additional ways that are important for their good and the good of society. And so it's just when we advocate for the common good in society, it's just one part of what it means to love others when we first love God.
As we read through your book, I'm thinking that it would be good for people to have seen or maybe even also order a copy of Faithfully Different, because you talk about some of those ideas, because we really need to articulate these ideas in the public square. Years ago, I met Richard John Newhouse when he wrote the book, The Naked Public Square, which had been stripped of religious values. You quote from Greg Forster, The Contested Public Square. But it does bring us into this very important question. Should Christians be political? You say yes. Should Christians impose their views on others? And again, the answer is yes, but you help us understand how to maybe deal with some of the objections that sometimes people have about this idea of articulating a biblical view in the public square. Can you kind of take us through that?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that's most important when we have the conversation about politics, and when you bring the common good into that realm, is to define politics, because people bring a lot of different baggage to that word. But politics is just the way in which people living in communities make decisions about how they're going to live together. That's all that word means. So when we put it in that context and we think about it that way, if we're Christians and we're citizens of a country that we live in a constitutional republic, well, in that form of government, everyone, Christians, Muslims, Mormons, everyone has a right to bring their views to bear in the public square. So it doesn't matter how you're forming those views or what your motivation is, whether it's a religiously motivated view or anything else, everyone has the right to bring their view to the public square. Now, as Christians, we have to check that against what the Bible teaches, because maybe we have the right in the society in which we live to do something that the Bible would say, hey, don't do that. But that's not what we see when we check against the Bible also. So there's no reason for us not to exercise our citizenship in that way. Like you said, one of the most common objections that you'll hear to that is, yeah, well, we can, but we shouldn't be imposing our views on others. But that's just a misunderstanding of the nature of public policy, because every public policy is going to impose one group's views on someone else. That's just the nature of public policy, that one view is going to be represented and the other view is not. And so we have to understand, when people accuse us of imposing our values on others, we're not doing that any more so than anyone else who's advocating for their views in the public square. And when we come back to the common good, as we were talking about before, if Christians understand what's truly good and what's truly evil, as opposed to what the world calls those things, of course we should be the ones who are out there advocating for that in the public square. If we don't, who will?
Well said. One of the arguments, objections, however you want to put it, is that Christians shouldn't be partisan. And this particular piece I'm going to share now, if you'll permit me, I'm going to use in a future commentary, because we hear that we shouldn't be partisan, but then you give us a couple of facts and figures. Of American adults who identify as historically black Protestants, 80% are or lean Democrat. Of American adults who identify as Buddhists, 69% are or lean Democrat. Of American adults who identify as Jewish, 64% are or lean Democrat. And of American adults who identify as Muslim, 62% are or lean Democrat. And you give a couple of examples, but researchers have found that more than half of these various religious groups lean Democratic. And we are never actually told that they should be less partisan. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about Buddhists, Jews, Muslims. Nobody's ever telling them that they should be less partisan. The only one that we ever seem to hear is that, quote, evangelical Christians should be less partisan, because they tend to be a little less on the side of Democrats and more on the side of Republicans. So I thought that was a pretty good argument that sometimes people haven't really thought about, and it illustrates again that sometimes these arguments are used only in one direction, aren't they?
There is very often a double standard when it comes to this, that if there's any sense that you lean conservative or you're advocating for unpopular positions that are usually identified with conservatism, then you are looked down upon. That is considered a toxic view to hold. It's just a matter of statistics that every group is going to lean one way or the other. Right? You're going to, unless you have exactly half of that group believing one thing and half believing the other thing, everyone's going to lean one way or the other. And as you just gave in all of those statistics, almost every other group leans towards the Democratic side, but no one ever says, hey, they're being too partisan. You only get that kind of objection when you're talking about leaning conservatively.
As we come to a break, let me just get into what I think is another very insightful test case that you provide, and that is slavery. Because let's take some of the arguments that were used against, quote, Christians imposing their views. And number one, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because, well, that would be imposing your views on others. Or number two, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because that involves seeking the power to do so. Or number three, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because getting involved with a political issue harms our witness. How many times have we heard that? Number four, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because it disrupted unity in the church. Or number five, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because Christians shouldn't have been partisan. You take each one of those five objections and apply it to something else, and you can see, in a sense, the fallacy of some of the objections, can't you?
That's exactly right. I think pretty much everyone today, fortunately, agrees that slavery was an objectively evil institution. Treating people like property is not how we should see the world, given that everyone is an image bearer of God. And so we can see that today. Fortunately, hindsight is 2020. So when you apply some of these same objections that you hear to getting involved with things like the pro-life issue today, for example, and you start to apply those same objections in the way you just did, I call that the slavery test, then it starts to make it obvious that this doesn't really hold up, logically speaking. To say, oh, well, we shouldn't have advocated against slavery because we shouldn't have been seeking power. Well, of course we should have advocated for that. We want the power to do good, right? But so often today, people will accuse Christians who are advocating for righteousness in the public square of just wanting power. You're just power hungry. But that doesn't hold up, because power is just the authority and the ability to execute a governing role. We should want to execute that in a good way. It needs to be stewarded well and not poorly. So I think when you apply those things to slavery like you just did, I think it becomes clear when the objection's not really valid, but really just often an excuse for not getting involved or not getting involved in a conservative, unpopular issue.
Let's take a break, but let me, as we go to the break, suggest you go to her website, natashacrain.com. First of all, you're going to find that she has great material there on equipping Christians to think biblically in a secular culture. There's a place where you can read her blog or listen to the podcast, read this and other books there as well. There's a way in which if you wanted to maybe have her come and speak, I would think she would be an ideal speaker for you and your church and a variety of different venues. So that is all available as well. We also, of course, have information about the book, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. It has been out for about a month, so I think you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a place for you to get it in paperback or Kindle. I think you'll find that very helpful there as well. And we've covered some of the chapters in the beginning. There's certainly more we could cover, but the second half gets into some of the really contentious issues. So we'll talk about how to apply those principles when we come back right after these important messages.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Natasha Crain. Let me just mention again that we have the website linked on our website at pointofview.net, or you can go directly to natashacrain.com. But Natasha, for just a minute, we might talk about some of the resources there. I mentioned the podcast, and one of your more recent podcasts is Does the Culture Hate Christians? And you have a variety of other podcasts that people can follow. There's a blog, there are your books, and there's an opportunity for people to schedule you to speak, but talk about some of the resources that we would love to make available to our listeners.
Well, yeah, like you said, I have several books. So my first 3 books are all apologetics books for parents, specifically to equip you and get you ready to be able to talk about these kinds of issues with your kids. And so you mentioned them earlier. Keeping Your Kids on God's Side is like an apologetics 101 for Christian parents, followed by Talking with Your Kids about God and Talking with Your Kids about Jesus. And then Faithfully Different was my last book, and now When Culture Hates You. And the podcast is called the Natasha Crain Podcast.
And again, lots of great resources. We have that available, and I would encourage you to do so. Before we get into the specific issues, you do have a chapter on this idea of perseverance, and that's important because we've recognized that kind of one of the themes here at Point of View was the idea of discernment. But I think more and more the other theme seems to be the need for boldness, and you have a whole section there on persevering in the public square, because it does require for us a little bit of tenacity, maybe a little more boldness, and an understanding that we can't simply step back and assume that people are going to do the right thing if they don't hear from those of us that are trying to articulate a responsible Christian position.
Right. I think that Christians really need to reset expectations in general. And I talk about that in that chapter that, if you expect that people are going to just look at you and think that you're a nice person or a good person because you've shared God's truth with them, then you're going to be really disappointed when they're actually very angry with you, or they actually think that you're a toxic person or a harmful person, as sometimes or very often now is happening in our culture. So we have to look back at Jesus's words about, telling his disciples that the world would hate them. And remember, there's a reason he had to say that. These aren't just empty words. The reason is that when we talk about these things, when we are being a light in culture and not just sitting on our hands in our living rooms, we're actually being a light in the way that we should be. We're exposing the deeds of darkness. And when you're exposing the deeds of darkness, people are not going to like you for that. So we need to reset our expectations to understand that the number of people in our society who are Bible-believing Christians, who have a biblical worldview, that number is decreasing and decreasing. And so we're going to see that a lot more people are not going to be friendly to the Christian message. And once we reset those expectations, then we're going to be in a better position to be able to advocate for righteousness, because we're not going to think, well, I've got to be comfortable to do this. We're going to know we're not going to be comfortable, and we should do it anyway.
Let me just mention now that the 5 following chapters are responding to and persevering through today's most prominent charges: Christian nationalism and social justice, pro-life activists, transgender activists, the sexual revolution, and then, of course, an epilogue. We may not get to all of those, but let's see if we can tackle one or two. And one of those is the idea of Christian nationalist. Now, Natasha, one of the things I've found, and you have already articulated this many times, is to define your terms, because sometimes what somebody calls Christian nationalism is just an epithet put at an individual that might just be patriotic. The other is something that I remember years ago, first hearing this phrase. I think David French first used it, nut picking, where you pick some nut on the opposite side and use that to extrapolate. And I remember when we did some programs a while back on this idea of Christian nationalism, there are some legitimate concerns, but one of the guests we had actually had written a piece in the Dallas Morning News, and I thought, well, let's get him on. So he's actually studied this. Well, the example he used was of a church in Colorado that I'd never heard of, that I don't know if anybody else had ever heard of, to illustrate the danger. And you got the sense that, okay, maybe you're extrapolating a little bit much from that. So really one of the keys, whether you're talking about the issue of abortion, transgenderism, social revolution, whatever it might be, is to define your terms, isn't it?
We have to define terms because, like you said, there's so many different ways that people define Christian nationalism. So when people ask, well, how should we respond to Christian nationalism? The question is always, well, what do you mean by Christian nationalism? Because it can take on so many different meanings. So what I did and focused on in my chapter was to look at this as the view from mainstream media, because the mainstream media is really who is talking about this the most. They're the ones who are saying there is this danger, there is this threat, it's pervasive, it's extreme, it's theocratic, it's anti-democratic. I mean, you hear all these words, and so but they don't define it. So what you have to do is actually look at the content they're producing to back into it and say, okay, they're talking about this dangerous Christian nationalism. Well, let's see in this article or in this video, what are their examples of it, so we can get an idea of what they mean. And so I surveyed hundreds of pieces of content along those lines, and what I found is that overwhelmingly, in the vast majority of cases, all they mean is that there are people who are advocating for certain views that are unpopular in society right now based on their biblical values. That's what it means. It's basically a pejorative against conservative Christians. And you can see this when you see the headlines and then you go into the content, and what you find out about this dangerous Christian nationalism is that there are Christians advocating for a pro-life view in the public square, or there are Christians who are advocating for quote-unquote anti-trans bills, which actually, if you look at them, it's actually for the good of trans people and the good of everyone else, but of course they label it anti-trans. So when you actually survey the examples they're using that they're labeling a dangerous Christian nationalism, all it means is that you want to bring your quote-unquote religious views to bear in the public square. And as we already talked about earlier today, that's just the nature of public policy. It's the nature of what we are able to do and we have the right to do in a constitutional republic. It's not anti-democratic. If we were being anti-democratic, we would be finding ways around our form of government to get our views imposed on everyone else. When you're working within the structure, we're using it exactly as it's intended to be used.
I might just mention, too, for those of you that maybe want to use this book as a study guide, because at the end of the first 5 chapters, there's always a summary. Then of these particular chapters that give you application, there's, for example, here, quick responses to 5 popular challenges on Christian nationalism. Then there's a follow-up section on the whole idea of what you can do, actions for the common good. So each one of these has lots of practical helps, also some material that you could use if you wanted to lead a small group through this area. But one other one I thought we'd pick off is, of course, the view from secular social justice advocates or activists, and that is power-hungry oppressors. And again, some of that gets into things we've talked about on this program before, critical race theory and queer theory and Black Lives Matter and the rest. But this is, again, something that we've been dealing with for about the last 4 or 5 years, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been percolating for a long time. It's just really kind of come up to the surface in the last 4 or 5 years. But these trends are rooted in something much longer, over a whole century, as you know. So, what it really comes down to is that society sees us, when they're looking at justice through the lens of critical theory, they see us as power-hungry oppressors. It's not just, hey, you're wrong about justice, Christians. It's you're actually harmful, you're oppressive, you're toxic. And so my goal really with all these chapters in the second half of the book is not just to look at it from a biblical perspective and to explain society's views, but to say, but why do they actually hate us for it? What is driving that kind of disdain? And so in this case, they think that we're oppressive because of the way that we view justice. So justice as a concept is making right that which is wrong, but that requires a standard of some kind to even define right and wrong in the first place. So as Christians, of course, God is the one who has to be our standard for defining those things. So we are making right the things that should be made right. Well, if you're a culture and you are secular, you are not going to use God as your standard. So anytime you're using another standard other than God for your idea of justice, you have a very good chance of getting it wrong. You're not always going to get it wrong. Sometimes it will happen to line up, but you're going to get it wrong a lot of times, because if your standard, for example, is the social binary, that you're dividing everyone into groups based on power dynamics, as critical theory does, then you're going to look at men, for example, as the group in power, and women as the victim group. And then you get something like reproductive justice out of that, which is just a euphemism for the right to kill a preborn baby. And so that's how justice goes wrong from the secular perspective. And they look at us when we say, hey, no, we're going to advocate for the right to life for this preborn baby. They're going to look at that and they're going to say, well, that's oppressive to women because they're using a different standard.
I may just mention as we go to a break that sometimes what you have to do is redefine or define accurately justice. Allie Beth Stuckey, who used to be a co-host here on Point of View, has done a PragerU on social justice isn't justice, and there's a difference between social justice and biblical justice, and that is certainly something you can find in this book as well. We'll come back and talk about a few other examples from When Culture Hates You. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Natasha Crain. Again, the book is entitled When Culture Hates You. And Natasha, you were talking about pro-life, so we might as well get to that chapter. Again, view from pro-choice activist, a controlling misogynist. And again, we have to understand that there have been, for some time, criticism of anybody that is pro-life. In some respects, I think that's heated up since June of 2022 with the Dobbs decision. And so in some respects, we again have to understand that the way in which we make our case using common grace really, I think, can appeal to individuals who maybe have never really thought through the issue, which is hard for me to believe given the fact that it's been around for decades and decades.
It is hard to believe. I mean, when you really think about what abortion is, it's hard to believe that anyone is going to advocate for the right to do that. But this is one of the goals, like I said earlier, of the book is to help Christians to not just understand a biblical view, but to understand the perspective that culture is coming from, so that it's not just so baffling to us, like, how can anyone believe this, but that we actually understand their view and why they hold it so we can better engage. And in the case of this topic in particular, I think it's important to understand that virtually no one is out there saying, yes, I love the right to kill babies. I want to kill babies. They're not saying that. They view this as an issue of harm to women, that if women don't have the right to do what they want with their body, and I understand that it's not their body, but I'm saying this is their perspective, that if women don't have that right, then they are harmed in some way. So their moral high ground from their perspective is that this is an issue of harm to women. Pro-life advocates, of course, are recognizing that first and foremost, this has to be an issue of harm to the preborn baby whose life is actually being lost in the process. But when we understand that culture views this as harm to women, then we can start looking at, okay, well, what kind of harm to women are we talking about? So in that chapter, I go through several examples of the claims about how the pro-life view is harmful to women, because if we can engage with culture more on those specific objections and showing that no, women are actually not harmed in any way by pro-life policies, then we're getting a step closer to actually making our case in a more effective way in the public square.
And it sort of relates to your other chapter dealing with transgender and even the issue of sexual revolution, because it is perceived and portrayed as, well, you are going to actually harm individuals. And actually, you can make the case, and you do make the case in both those chapters, that if you want to actually help individuals, if you want to promote human flourishing, if you want to prevent sexually transmitted diseases, if you want to no longer have to deal with some of the emotional baggage, what we are calling for from a biblical point of view is what the creator of sex in the first place has called for, and the need for us to really begin to reevaluate some of the myths that we've picked up from our secular culture.
That's right. I think it's one of the hardest things for Christians to sometimes get our heads around, that sometimes we have to be advocating for the good of people in a way that they don't want for themselves. That's very hard for us to get our heads around. So if somebody who identifies as transgender says, you're harming me with your view, you're not allowing me to take the steps necessary medically, for example, to do what's going to make me feel best about myself, well, we're going to have a different view, because as you said, if there's a creator and sustainer of the universe who has revealed through Scripture who he is and who we are as mankind, then we're going to understand objectively what human purpose is, and objectively what the design is that he has given us for human flourishing, including gender and sexuality. And so when we understand those things, then we know objectively what is good for people, because that is going to promote their flourishing. That doesn't mean they're going to agree with us. They can be really, really upset with us. They can hate us. They can think that we're cruel rights deniers, as I titled that chapter on transgenderism. Mm-hmm. But we still have to advocate for their good, even when it's not what they want for themselves, because we need to love them enough to love them the way that God loves them.
Let me just mention at the very end, you have recommendations for further study, and it reads like the kinds of books that we do interviews on here at Point of View. Erwin Lutzer's The Eclipse of God, Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Jack Hibbs' Living in the Days of Deception, Greg Koukl, Tactics, as well as Erwin Lutzer's book on We Will Not Be Silenced, Mark David Hall's on Did America Have a Christian Nation, as well as all the way down to Abigail Schreier, Irreversible Damage, or Nancy Pearcey and Love Thy Body, and just a whole series of other books that we have spent some time talking about here on Point of View. But Natasha, talk about just in the next minute or two how people can use this book. I've already recommended the way you've put it together, since the end of each one of the first 5 chapters has kind of a summary of some of the key points. And then you have later on in the next 5 chapters, when you take on some of these issues, a whole section on certainly the quick responses to popular challenges and then actions for the common good. But how can people use this book in a way that might certainly take these ideas and expand them in society?
Well, that is my hope for the book, that it's not just a book of analysis that helps you better understand things. That's a starting point, and I sure hope that it does. But I hope that that better understanding leads people to engage in a more effective way with those around them and to take steps to actually be light, to make a difference in society. So like you said, in each of the 5 chapters in the second half of the book, there are suggested actions, example actions for the common good of all kinds of different natures, because I'm not suggesting with this book that everyone has to be out there doing the exact same thing. I'm not saying that every person in every season of life has to be out there advocating for a specific issue in a specific way. We all are in different places in our lives and have different interests and abilities and knowledge bases. There's something that everyone can do to shine light in the darkness on all of these subjects. So I hope that people will not just sit on this book with some better understanding, but rather that they're actually going to take steps and say, I'm going to be bolder in culture because I love God and I love others.
Let me again just mention that you can listen to this again by clicking on that button that says watch or listen. You might want to go back to the previous interview we did with Natasha on Faithfully Different, Regaining Biblical Clarity in a Secular Culture. Or again, for those of you who are parents and would like to educate your children, a lot of those various apologetics books for parents are also available on her website. And of course, this book is When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. It was great to see you the other day. Thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View, and thank you for writing the book.
Thanks so much. It's been great talking with you.
Let's, if we can, again, encourage you to find out a little bit more. That is at the website, pointofview.net. And I think we all agree that America is really changing. It's maybe changing too fast for many of us. And so whether we're looking at politics or religion, education, culture, the family, we are seeing remarkable, many people even refer to them as seismic changes. And when we recognize that only a minority, a very small minority of Americans hold to a true biblical worldview, we are the minority, and it's going to be even more important for us to know how to make the case with using the common good. We can't just say, well, thus the Bible says, because a lot of people say, well, I don't believe the Bible. Or even if they are people in your church, they may say they believe the Bible, but they really have not applied a consistent biblical worldview to every area of life. And so this is certainly one of those books that I think can be kind of a wake-up call for Christians to understand that we're going to be in an area of hostility, and it's going to be really important for us to know how to make the case. So again, we want you to know how to articulate a biblical worldview, but also how to defend it. And this book gives you an ability to debunk some of the arguments that you hear so often, and that's why we commend the book to you. Again, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. And you're listening to Point of View.
Are you confused about changes happening in Washington, D.C.? Well, you're not alone. Are you frustrated that you can't get the full picture of what's happening from the mainstream media? You are not alone in that either. And that is why Americans need a voice they can trust, a voice that provides accurate news, trustworthy information, and most importantly, a voice that is anchored to God's Word. Point of View is that voice, but we need you. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week, where we encourage listeners like you to join the team of people keeping truth on the air. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can make a difference right now by visiting us online at pointofview.net and join the team. That's pointofview.net. Or you can call us toll-free to join at 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you.
It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're of course going to get into all the issues in the news, and not the least of which is what happened Friday. While we were doing the broadcast, we were already making some comments about the back and forth between President Zelensky and President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance and others, and we will certainly get into that in due course. I've oftentimes said that some of these conflicts that show up on the main screen, and this one certainly was quite visible, are the ultimate kind of political Rorschach test or inkblot test. Everybody sees what they want to see out of it. I have had people telling me that this was a classic illustration of President Zelensky asking for so much and being unappreciative. I've had people tell me that what J.D. Vance was saying was completely inappropriate. I've had people say that what the Trump administration now is doing the bidding of the Russian government, and that there are people that are naive about Vladimir Putin. I've had other people that have said that this is a good illustration of the kind of corruption that has taken place in Ukraine, maybe an illustration of the way in which sometimes President Zelensky talked to the former president, Joe Biden. As a matter of fact, we know, if you have not seen this, some great videos of him getting angry with him as well, or even a continuation of what led to the impeachment the first time, or one of the first times, of Donald Trump because of the phone call that he had between him and President Zelensky. So everybody sees what they want to see, and I'll get into the details. And of course, we'll open up the phones to give you some comments. I'm sure you have quite a few. But I thought it would be appropriate to start with an article I was going to use on Thursday or Friday, and this really didn't come about. It is written by David Bahnsen. Now, if you say that name sounds vaguely familiar, he was on at least twice last year. I've, of course, known his father and also appreciated him. But he wrote this piece, which has the title, Curb Your Hysteria. Now, he wrote it back in February. Of course, I guess much of this did happen in February, but we're now into March, by the way. And this was before the dust-up or the shouting match or the conflict that was taking place in the Oval Office. But I think it is wise because he goes on to say that at one point in my adult life, much later than I wish it had, I learned that a person worth emulating is a person who possesses poise, calm, and sobriety. He says, I've not often observed unchecked zeal to be the stuff that Super Bowl champions or good portfolio managers, which is he is one, or good friends or productive adults are made of. And so he's a little bit concerned about, as we have been, the two sides, and sometimes there's more than two sides, are shouting each other, not listening to each other, and aren't necessarily evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of their own argument as they begin to point out the problems with someone else's argument. And he says the current political environment brings this reality for individuals into the public realm. The Trump moment generates excitability and in some cases outright hysteria. It does so for good reasons. There can be bad reasons, he points out, as well. But the point he makes is that this is, in a sense, the world we find ourselves in. And he says, he takes on both sides, I've seen opponents of President Trump rehash the Hitler line. The news reporters assume that free speech is a weapon that can cause genocide. That's one that we talked about a week ago. And otherwise intelligent people claim that the president is setting up a corrupt government, which he intends to never leave. As he points out, a lot of these comments, statements fall on deaf ears because they've been overplayed really for the last 9 years. But then he goes on to take the other side on. He says, I would be lying if I did not say that there's an equal amount of hysteria from some Trump supporters, which in some ways is more disturbing, mostly because it's less expected. He talks about people making such statements. And again, I don't agree with this. He doesn't either. What President Trump has done in the last 5 weeks is nothing short of Churchillian, Reaganite, or Lincoln-esque. And again, there are all sorts of hyperbole being used and made statements and the rest. And he then talks about that even with the various executive orders that President Trump has signed, he says these are easy orders to sign, lacking in stickiness and natural popular actions given the current state of the culture. But he says, hear me correctly, they should be celebrated, but analogies of these executive orders to winning the Cold War or things like this is right up there with the Gettysburg Address or the tax bill of the 1980s are simply preposterous. It would have been helpful if he had some links to some of those because obviously he's seen and heard some that I haven't seen as well. But here's the point. He says the hysteria of Trump haters and the hysteria of Trump lovers is not the subject of the article. He says, my primary caution is for those tempted to be hysterical about the hysterics. He says, for example, many on the right feel that they were marginalized to the fringe of society. Even the conversation we had today with Natasha Crain could make you feel like that. Really, the culture hates us. And he says, in some respects, they feel that maybe America's walls of DNA really and civic order weren't enough. And Boyne points out that election losses, whether in 2020 or 2024, depress people, and cultural losses depress people even more. But he says if you're going to really weather the storm, if you're going to really be able to kind of make your way through these turbulent years of 2025, and 2024 was turbulent as well, going all the way back to 2019 probably, he says, look, disappointments will come and sober judgment will materialize, but along the way, some human excess has to be treated with grace. I don't say this to sermonize. I recommend it as a therapeutic approach. Dealing with the hysteria will be much easier with an anti-hysterical approach. There is lots of sound and fury right now from those who believe Trump is Hitler and those who believe that Trump is Jesus. I hope not. But nevertheless, there is some legitimacy in sound and fury. He goes on to actually point out that I'm well aware that polls are now showing that Trump's peak might be fading. Everyone can feel a certain exhaustion with some of the chaos. I'm also aware that many of the actions of the new administration of the last 5 weeks have been wildly popular with the American people. But he goes on to remind us that, some of that will be coming to an end. And he says coverage of the state affairs lacks rationality, balance, and good balance. And good measure should be taken with a grain of salt. He says the need of the hour for our political scene is the same thing we've all needed when we become adults: wisdom, grace, and restraint. Calm people are impressive people. The best advice, as someone who is laser focused on the short-term victories, tax reform, deregulation, meritocracy, that do not violate our long-term mission, the constitutional order, the country of character, conserving the American ideals of freedom and virtue, is that you do your best to ignore the hyperbole and hysteria on all sides, to call balls and strikes, there are plenty of both, I assure you, and to stay calm in your own response, both to the administration and to the historical response of others. He says this too shall pass. With that as background, let's get into, of course, the controversy last week and the controversy still unfolding, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Sean McDowell observes that in a culture that glamorizes sex, chases fame, and shames those who don't fall in line, it takes a rebel to be a Christian. That is why the title of his new book is A Rebel's Manifesto. His book for young Christians focuses on the challenge, the culture, relationships, sexuality, ethics, and cultural engagement. He published much of this in a previous book as Ethics, Being Bold in a Whatever World. When I did a radio program with him, we talked about the fact that he needed to both update chapters and add new chapters. The section on relationships were added because of current problems with loneliness, bullying, and suicide, and a chapter on transgender ideology also needed to be added. You know, we talked about the fact that Sean McDowell will oftentimes role play as an atheist and take questions from Christian students. After he finishes, he asks them to describe how they treated their atheist guests. They often use words like rude, aggressive, and disrespectful, and then concludes that if this is how they treated a fellow Christian role playing as an atheist, perhaps they have a lot to learn about better loving their neighbors. We also spent some time talking about the influence of smartphones and social media. For example, he lists 5 ways smartphones influence you. It affects, for example, how we access truth. It affects us emotionally and spiritually. It also affects our identities and relationships. This is a book that you should give to your children or grandchildren, but I would also encourage you to give a copy to your youth leader. At the end of each chapter are questions that can be used to guide a small group discussion with young people. These are issues they confront, and they need a sound biblical perspective this book provides. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can get into this. And one of the articles I've posted is a piece that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, actually did after this dust-up or blow-up or whatever you want to call it on CNN. And I thought that was a good kind of point-counterpoint. I'm going to follow it up with a piece by Kurt Schlichter, who's been on the program before. He's somebody that you have to kind of use a little more sparingly, if for no other reason that he does some pop off with certain words, and poor Megan would have to be getting near the swear button of he was on. Matter of fact, recently I saw where he had produced this one video, and somebody said afterwards, Kurt would do a lot better if he didn't do these podcasts when he had been partaking of adult beverages. But even when he's sober, he gives us some difficulties around here. But I think this piece on 10 hard facts about Ukraine and NATO is very helpful for this reason. He says, I like the Ukrainians. I trained them and we actually worked with them in deployment, and so he's got some good facts. I think at least 7 of the 10 I think very helpful of. But the first piece I wanted to come to is where Marco Rubio, who I tend to see a little bit more perspective. I think sometimes he can step back and see what is happening. Of course, he's the one that first reported that originally when he met with President Zelensky, along with others, on this deal for the rare earths, said, well, yes, we might be willing to consider that. Let me take it to my legislative council. Then immediately went out and started saying that I told them to their face, we are never going to be bullied by the United States of America. And I thought, first of all, you lied to the Secretary of State and others in the room. I think the Vice President was there at the time as well, which is why the Vice President got a little testy with him as well, and then lied to the Ukrainian people. But nevertheless, the bottom line was that this was supposed to be just a signing, and it was something that would actually bind the United States to Ukraine. I think that's going to eventually be a done deal. He actually said that the agreement was supposed to be signed on Friday. It would actually also include later on a security guarantee. He said, though, on CNN on Friday night, I think that the President Zelensky should apologize because he was turning this thing into a fiasco that did not need to take place, because the goal of the meeting, he said, was to finalize an economic agreement for the United States to gain access to Ukraine's natural resources. Now, are they bullying this country? Well, the argument being made is, look, we have spent, and there's where you start getting into the numbers, $175 billion or $350 billion, depending on who you listen to. We'll leave that for another conversation later. But in the interview he did with CNN's Caitlin Collins, she pushed back a couple of times, which I think was appropriate as well. So you can read this, and the idea was that this was supposed to be signed, and there was really not the idea that it was even supposed to be signed in front of the press. It was supposed to be signed 5 days earlier, but Zelensky wanted to come to Washington and apparently lecture Donald Trump on diplomacy. And, of course, the argument being made by, of course, President Zelensky is you can't trust the Russians. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. And at the same time, the argument being made by the government, at least the United States, is there at least some chance that we can bring Russia to the peace table? He said if there's a chance of peace, even if it's a 1% chance, that needs to be explored. But that's, of course, where Caitlin Collins pointed out, you have referred to Putin as a war criminal and a butcher. By the way, accurate terms, not disagreeing with that at all. But you don't come into a conversation calling him a war criminal if you want to get him to the peace tables. And so you have some people saying by not calling him a war criminal to his face and actually trying to meet with him, you're advancing the Russian agenda. And, of course, that's the argument being made as well, that the Donald Trump is naive. That's really hard for me to argue, or that this was a setup. We'll come to that in just a few minutes. So this piece kind of gives you some back and forth where some of the statements being made by Marco Rubio were then challenged by Caitlin Collins. And near the end, he takes on all sorts of things that have been misreported. I think falsely reported, maybe intentionally falsely reported. For example, he was very upset about the reports that said that the United States had not coordinated with the Ukrainians on negotiations. He said that's absolutely false. Over the last 10 days, the Ukrainians have met with the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of State, the Vice President of the United States, even had a phone call with President Trump, and of course he was in the Oval Office on Friday. So again, I try to give you some pieces that give you a little more context, because most people have either said, oh, I'm so grateful that Donald Trump, stood up for the American people, or Donald Trump is advancing the Russian interest. And I think that's maybe why I wanted to also bring you this piece by Kurt Schlichter. First of all, because he likes the Ukrainians and worked with them. 10 hard facts. I'm just going to pick out 7 before we take a break. Number 1, the obvious one. Russia is absolutely in the wrong for invading Ukraine. So you start with that. Anytime you then point out some of the issues with Ukraine, immediately say, well, then you're advancing Russia, or you're actually not acknowledging where Russia is at fault. No, that's the starting point. And again, he goes on to say nothing Ukraine did excuses or justifies Russians' actions, but we still need to understand why. He gives us one of the historical factors we've talked about before, and that is if you look at the map of Ukraine, In the eastern part, there's a place where most of those individuals are Russian-speaking people. Russia has considered Ukraine to be part of Russia, and there where you have ethnic Russians who sometimes, even if they speak Russian to Ukrainians, they get mad. So you have to understand it is a country that is somewhat divided. Geographically, it looks nice on a map, just as, say, Yugoslavia looked nice on a map, or Czechoslovakia. But, once the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain fell, a couple things changed there as well. But that's point number one. Russia's at fault. Number two, Ukraine is not going to be able to win the war if the definition of winning the war is recovering all the conquered Ukrainian territory. Russia's in a war footing. Russia has more resources than Ukraine has access to, and you can understand that taking back some of that land probably is not going to happen. Likely is not going to happen. Number three, President Zelensky will have to accept the reality that America will need to be paid back for its aid, which means, as a practical matter, access to Ukraine's mineral reserves. This could be a joint venture that would help them and us repay some of us, put in businesses there as well, various factories and industries, which would then give them income to rebuild a completely devastated country. And so that is the case. Number four, this is the one we've talked about before. Ukraine is an unbelievably corrupt country, and the idea that no substantial portion of our aid money has been stolen is ridiculous. If you go out on the internet, there are all sorts of stories being told. I sometimes say, I don't even know who to trust, but there are people talking about funds making their way here and there and everywhere. Peter Schweitzer, I've quoted before, take his book, for example, Secret Empires, How the Political Class Hides Corruption and Enrich Family and Friends. This certainly has been helpful to the Biden family. It's been helpful to various Democrats and Republicans, too. I think I mentioned the other day, Paul Manafort, for a while, was part of the Trump kind of kitchen cabinet. You might notice he's not there anymore. You can even read the book by Dan Bongiovi on Follow the Money. You can get some of the facts there as well. Number five, the American people, by and large, are tired of subsidizing Ukraine's ending of this war. And another one, Europeans should be taking the lead in supporting Ukraine and should be taking the lead in defending Europe. Well, it turns out that that is one that we saw because after he left, President Zelensky went to Europe and was greeted with open arms. And now the UK and France are talking about the coalition of the willing. And one other one, he says there, the campaign to insult critics of past Ukrainian policy by calling them Putin's puppets and so forth is a lie and is going to result in enmity towards the idea of helping the Ukrainians, I think is an accurate one as well. Just gave you 7 of the 10 hard facts, but those are some things that need to really be addressed. I thought when we come back, okay, let's talk about who's at fault. I think you can find it all the way down the list. And so we'll give you some facts on that real quickly, but also we'll open up the phones. Maybe you have some thoughts about that as well. Obviously, President Zelensky was trying to say, I know we can't trust the Russians. You have no idea what it's like to have lost so many people in Ukraine. They've devastated our country. Donald Trump, J.D. Vance say, we understand that, but can we find some way to bring about peace and end this meat grinder? And many times they were talking past each other, but I'd love to get your thoughts as well. 1-800-351-1212. Also going to move on to some other topics because, as you might imagine, there's a lot going on today. We'll be right back.
In 19th century London, 2 towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
By the way, as a program note, this is going to be an interesting week. Tomorrow we have Steve Taylor with us. We'll be talking about the arts for a while, and then we'll be kind of getting ready for the fact that tomorrow night is actually an unofficial State of the Union address. Don't you think some of these issues, whether it's DOJ or deportation or the issue of Ukraine, are going to surface? Obviously they are, in terms of the speech by President Trump, but also the reaction from Congress should be very interesting. So on Wednesday, going to spend some time with our good friend Gary Bauer to evaluate the State of the Union address. Then we're going to have, if that's not enough, our good friend Sean McDowell, his new book coming out as well, which really is almost a good companion to the conversation we had today with Natasha Crain on When the Culture Hates You. So I think we are going to be in for quite a bit. That just gets us to Wednesday. By the time we get to, of course, our Friday weekend edition, much more. Let me say a few more things about this and then move on to some other topics. And that is, let's just look at the principles here. Putin, Vladimir Putin. I think we've already made the case, but let's make it again. An evil individual. An individual that has been with the KGB, an individual that is probably, I think you could make the very compelling case. I can make it in my mind, but again, you have to prove it in a court of law, a war criminal. And so the kinds of things the Russian army has done are inexcusable. So that's on the table. And the argument being made sometimes, which now brings us to Donald Trump, is you're naive. It's one of the few times I've ever heard somebody refer to Donald Trump as naive. He's kind of a deal maker, but it's possible. And, of course, some arguments are even making the idea that Trump really likes Vladimir Putin. I'm not sure that he does, but okay, if that's your perspective, I can't maybe push you off of that. But I also recognize if you're going to try to bring somebody to the table, whether it's the leader, the dictator of North Korea, or the dictator of China, or the president, or essentially the dictator of Russia, you don't start out by referring to them as a butcher and a war criminal if you want to try to bring them to a table with the possibility of bringing about a ceasefire or peace. Which, of course, brings us to Donald Trump, because some people say, well, Donald Trump likes Putin and he actually hates Zelensky. Okay. How did that come about? Well, remember when Donald Trump, as I mentioned about 10 days ago, referred to Zelensky as an elected dictator? Okay, hyperbole. Later on, he said, did I say that? Typical Trump. Okay. But let's be honest, as Victor Davis Hanson and others have pointed out, President Zelensky has postponed a scheduled election. In many cases, he suppressed habeas corpus. Right now, of course, because they're under war footing, under martial law, he's shut down opposition media. He's really taken political power. He's shut down free speech. I would say that if you're trying to understand, again, President Zelensky, probably good to understand some of the problems there. And I just mentioned some of the scandals, of which those are well known. And if we have to bring Peter Schweitzer on here or a variety of other individuals to document those, glad to do so. There are certainly a lot of stories out there about the way in which some of the money has been spent by some of those leaders in Ukraine in the past, including by the president. But we'll leave it at that as loan. And of course, then this also brings up one of the issues that you heard from the media, and that is that this was an attempted, if you will, ambush. And so one of the posts here from Jessica Berlin was the Oval Office ambush is a wake-up call to Europe. America doesn't have your back. You're out of time. Seize Russian assets in the EU. Embargo Russian energy. Allow Ukraine to hit targets in Russian territory with missiles. Well, first of all, Michael Tracy, not exactly an individual that would be considered pro-Trump, about pretty much left of center, said, wait a minute, and he posted this on X. Anyone who rationally watched the full 50 minutes will see it was not an ambush. The first 40 minutes were normal and cordial. Then came this self-inflicted meltdown by Zelensky. If you can't rationally describe the meeting, perhaps your policy extrapolations are also irrational. I've run into some people that said, more than I would do it, I sat down and watched it a second time. I said, you got more patience than I do. And they're saying, no, this looked like a pretty straightforward, formal meeting that kind of got out of hand pretty quickly. And Michael Tracy went on a little bit later saying then there is an irony in this paranoid EU overreaction to every one of Donald Trump's statements that is the end of the Western alliance. This could impale, as they said, at least some of those individuals to take a rash action towards Ukraine. Even says the irony of that meeting was that we are on the cusp of formalizing Ukraine as sort of a U.S. protectorate with continued U.S. military aid and a framework for deploying NATO troops, all of which were major U.S. commitments under the circumstances. But apparently, again, Michael Tracy says that was not enough. So that brings us to one other individual. Sometimes the press hasn't done a great job of covering it. But what about J.D. Vance? Well, if you can summarize J.D. Vance here, first of all, he made the case that Europeans were terrified because they were concerned about their own domestic interest. But at the same time, as we pointed out on Friday, some of them haven't exactly been giving the kind of funding that Donald Trump thinks they should be giving funding to NATO or to the war effort. Given the advantages, J.D. Vance made the case in terms of GDP, population, natural resources, and area, it just didn't look like we could realistically, even with the current arms shipments, have Ukraine realistically defeat Russia. And so the argument being made is the United States has leverage both on Ukraine and Russia. But of course, a lot of people have been critical of him, if for no other reason, talking about the fact that you don't seem very appreciative. But that is not something that is unique to that meeting. If you want to go back to 2022, and NBC has covered this, and you can find this out on the internet, they were working very hard at the time to point out some of the tiff, some of the conflict between Joe Biden and President Zelensky. President Biden actually got angry, and there was all sorts of issues because, again, President Zelensky wanted more. He wanted more armaments. He wanted more munitions, and also seemed very inappreciative. And again, if you watch that, he was wanting the individuals sitting around there at the Oval Office to realize what it's like to have lost so many individuals, to have seen the devastation of your country, and to recognize that he's fighting a war just to stay alive, and he doesn't trust Vladimir Putin. So I think we can honestly come to a rational conclusion that those were certainly some conflicts that have been brewing for some time. Some of those conflicts actually surfaced a while back under Joe Biden and will continue to surface as we go forward. Is there a possibility that this particular mineral rights agreement will be signed? I think the answer to that is yes. Interestingly enough, after President Zelensky was there in the Oval Office, he went to Fox News. Brett Barr asked him for an apology. I don't know that you got one. Other people say he did apologize. Again, everybody sees what they want to see in this whole thing. But the bottom line is where is he going to go? Yes, Europe is going to provide some funds. I think they said they were going to provide, what was it, $1 billion? Okay, that is more than nothing. But given the kind of armaments necessary and the kind of military action, we are dealing with a Russia that is at a war footing, and as a result seems to be dedicated to smashing the last remnants of the Ukrainian army and to actually take over that country. What can be done? Well, the only argument you seem to be getting from Europe right now is let's keep fighting until eventually Russia declares, a willingness to come to the peace table. And that is, I think, somewhat dangerous because one of the other things raised by Donald Trump, you heard it more than once, is World War III. One of the reasons I did a booklet a couple of months ago on nuclear war is, first of all, because that whole issue of nuclear war surfaced last year with of course, the movie that won Best Picture of the Year in the Oscars. By the way, the Oscars were last night. Did anybody watch those? Probably not. Anyway, it's a side point. But we have a whole generation that maybe does not understand how devastating a nuclear conflict, if it unfolded in between Russia and Ukraine, could be to the world. So this is not one with easy answers. Hopefully I've given you a lot of different perspectives and sides to a conversation that sometimes isn't well covered by the mainstream press. But we try to give you some articles to read. So again, this one about Marco Rubio in CNN, and also the one on 10 hard facts about Ukraine and NATO are certainly worth your read. We'll come back and talk about the fact that we're going to declare English as the official language.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Last few minutes, I have a question for you, and that is, should the United States actually have English as the official language? Now, it is interesting to see why that developed, and that is back when he was the second president of the United States, John Adams, in 1780, actually proposed that English be the official language of America, but it was a little more difficult to get that enacted because at the time we had so many different people here as colonists who spoke multiple languages. You had those individuals that came here from Germany that spoke German, but they also spoke English. You had some people that came here from Italy and they also spoke Italian. And you had a few people from France that here and they spoke French and English. And you had the Dutch. You had a variety of different languages. Most people at that time had to be somewhat bilingual, but it seemed just maybe a little bit forceful to make English the official language, and then it kind of just incubated there for a while. I remember when I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was a man by the name of S.I. Hayakawa. He was a professor at San Francisco State University. He later became a senator, a U.S. senator from California, but back then he was a grammarian and he was a linguist, and he really called for the idea of America to actually officially adopt English as the official language. Again, it didn't seem like a big issue, but it was an issue because over the weekend, Donald Trump signed an executive order designating English as the official language of the United States. It is the first designation in the country's history, and you will see that one of the articles I've posted comes from National Public Radio, NPR. Elena Moore, I think she does a good job of covering both a point and counterpoint. First of all, the order that he signed on Saturday is really more than just designating English as the official language, because essentially it also rescinds a policy that was implemented all the way back in the 1990s by President Bill Clinton, which at the time required agencies to provide assistance programs with people with limited English proficiency. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that back then, it was sort of being thought that, well, you provide English and then Spanish, but as you well know, you can go to certain parts of the country, Los Angeles being one. I think I was seeing the list of nearly 100 different languages spoken within the Los Angeles school system. So obviously that is the case of trying to provide it for everyone, but one of the reasons why I think that churches should consider doing ESL, which stands for English as a Second Language, is it's a great opportunity to integrate people into the American system. And so the order allows agencies, if they want, to voluntarily keep those support systems in place, but no longer does it mandate that. I think that makes some sense as well. And so the order says a nationally designated language is at the core of a unified and cohesive society, and the United States is strengthened by a citizenry that can freely exchange ideas in one shared language. Now, if you want to understand what's happening in the states, more than 30 states already have listed English as an official language. And yet we still understand that we are a multilingual culture, because if you look at the latest data from the U.S. Census, that estimates roughly about 1 in 10 people now speak a language other than English, and that is almost 3 times as much as what was in the 1980s. Why is that happening? Well, you know why. We've had an open border. And when you have people coming here from Guatemala and Venezuela and Colombia, they speak Spanish. When they come here from China, they speak, of course, Chinese, maybe 2 different kinds of Chinese. When they come from different parts of Africa, it can be Swahili, it could be French, it could be whatever they know in that particular area. Of course, when they come from the European countries, it could be German, Italian, French, all sorts of things of that nature. And so there's where we find ourselves today. What I think is interesting is that in an attempt for an NPR to give some back and forth, they quote from Roman Palomares, who is the head of the League of United Latin American Citizens, who was critical, of course, of Trump's administration's statement, saying, quote, "Our founding fathers enshrined freedom of speech in the First Amendment without limiting it to one language. They envisioned a nation where diversity of thought, culture, and expression would be its greatest strengths." I think that's probably true, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily say that we couldn't have English as the official language. He went on to say, declaring English as the only official language directly contradicts that vision. He went on to say, America thrives when we embrace inclusivity, not when we silence the voice of millions who contributes to its success. Well, again, as we started the program talking about curb your hysteria, there's a good example. When you say English is the official language of America, we're not silencing the voice of millions who contribute to its success. If anything, we certainly are a melting pot people, but in the past, what oftentimes took place was, yes, you would come here from Germany, you would come here from Ireland, you'd come here from Italy, you'd come here from Spain, you'd come across the border from Mexico, you'd come here from China or Japan, and for a while, you would be in your culture. And you would speak that language. And oftentimes you would speak that language at home, and then you would go off to school and you would learn English, because if you're going to thrive in America, you learn English. By the way, that is true in other countries as well. As you may know, from time to time, I'm invited to go and speak at Word of Life in the Philippines. They say the future for you in the Philippines is to learn English, because if all you know is Tagalog, that is not going to help you if you're going to be successful in the 21st century. When I go to Word of Life in Hungary, first of all, Hungarian is a linguistic island. Only people in Hungary and a few people in Romania speak Hungarian. So if you don't speak another language like English, you're going to be really hurt in the future. So isn't it interesting that when you go to other countries, they recognize how important it is to speak English? If you're a pilot, you better know how to speak English, because that's the language of pilots. If you really want to understand what's on the internet, although we certainly, even in our own ministry, have a Spanish website and a website that has a little bit of Arabic and a little bit of Chinese, most of it is in English, and that is the case as well. So maybe sometime in the future we'll open up the phones and give you a chance to express your opinion about that. But Donald Trump over the weekend decided to actually make English the official language of the United States. Of course, it's just an executive order. The next president could reverse it, and it's another good example of something that probably needs to be enculturated and maybe even legislated. And when I mention that one last time, we do have our take action item. Tell your member of the House of Representatives no taxpayer funding for abortion. Yes, of course, we have an executive order, but we're going to, over the next couple of weeks, talk about different pieces of legislation to actually make official something that Donald Trump has tried to do with his executive order. So if you haven't taken the time to go to the website, Point of View, you'll see my viewpoints commentary today on a Sean McDowell book. We'll be talking with him about his new book on Wednesday, and you'll find out a lot more about these issues. Most importantly, I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program, and we will look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Are you confused about changes happening in Washington, D.C.? Well, you're not alone. Are you frustrated that you can't get the full picture of what's happening from the mainstream media? You are not alone in that either. And that is why Americans need a voice they can trust, a voice that provides accurate news, trustworthy information, and most importantly, a voice that is anchored to God's Word. Point of View is that voice, but we need you. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week, where we encourage listeners like you to join the team of people keeping truth on the air. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can make a difference right now by visiting us online at pointofview.net and join the team. That's pointofview.net. Or you can call us toll-free to join at 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just wanted to tell you, too, how much I have appreciated Point of View over the years. I've always been taught that we take care of our own, and I feel like Point of View is one of our own because of the Christian worldview that you do promote. And so I have become a partner today, and I just want to thank you so much, and just God bless you for all that you do.
Listen, I wanted to make a quick comment. I'm a relatively new listener to the show, and I really kind of stumbled upon it more than anything because I'm doing some driving now that I wasn't in the past. And my comment really is, I think you guys and gals are more right on about the assessment of this country right now than anything I've heard. You know, I go home and I tell my wife, you've got to hear what they're talking about on the show. It's just so right on. And I tell my parents the same thing.
I'm 25 years old, and I started listening to Point of View about 4 years ago, and it has changed the way that I think and the way that I view the world around me.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.